broader dimensions. It's a way of widening them out, saying what's implied. What is it we really meant? What is it the founders really meant? Or what is it the founders really should have meant? Depending on your particular mode of interpretation of the Constitution. What is it the founders meant to mean? There's second order. Like, maybe I didn't know that, but now that I see it, it's what I would have said. I was aiming at that. I just didn't hit it. One could imagine that. Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. And you have any ideas how in the American tradition things get in that list? You would think it's a pretty important question as to whether people have a right to universal health care, for example, one you were pointing to, Rachel. And
that's a good question. I don't know how things find their way into that list, other than like things that are already present in prominent documents of our founding. I don't know how things find their way in that list.
Like an amendment, I guess, but we don't really do that anymore.
Well, we still could. The process is still in place, right? In fact, wasn't it in your very recent adult lifetimes that the final, wasn't there a state that ratified the Equal Rights Amendment in the last few years?
Yes.
Outside the formal window of amendment right? You're supposed to have for a constitutional action. There's so many years that you have to get the states to ratify, and this fell outside that, if I remember the story right.
I think the Equal Rights Amendment, the timeline expired in like the 80s or maybe even 90s. I don't know. It expired a long time ago. And I think it was even a month ago that another state ratified it, like very recently, but right. It's out of the timeline, and
yeah, I think it was 2020.
Is gridlocked on everything.
Yep, that's right. So all I meant to say there is that you're right, John, that we haven't done anything like that. When was our last amendment? Constitutional scholars should know this, and maybe all Americans should know it if they have a copy of the Constitution that's updated in their possession.
I don't think it was in my lifetime.
Let's see. I should know this, but at the moment I'm drawing a blank. Sorry to say. It was in my lifetime. Do I believe that to be true? The Equal Rights Amendment didn't pass, but yeah, we were showing ourselves to be poor constitutional scholars here. That's all right.
There's a lot of things we can be poor at, and that's okay. There's some things we're good at.
Yeah. As long as you don't pretend to be a constitutional scholar.
I don't.
I try not to. Occasionally, I'd probably fail.
I used to have a pocket constitution. I don't have it anymore, I don't think.
I've got one upstairs in the drawer, but the truth is I haven't looked at it in a while. At least not the whole of it and not the last amendments of it. So, but we do have this, and there's a couple ways to amend, and that's right. So it's not out of the question. And we have made incredibly important amendments, right? And the 14th Amendment, whose function I remember clearly and whose name I remember a little less clearly at the moment, it'll pop into my head. But you have a right to due process. You have, let's see, the 14th Amendment maybe in, it's often cited in any case. It's a very active ground. It's a reason why laws which are not in fact enforced can't have the force of law. or unenforceable law, can't have the force of law, things like that.
Yeah, I forget what it's called, but like there has to be someone hurt by a law.
Equal protection, the equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment, right? That's the one that's often cited in that context. So, yeah, how do they get in? Apparently, a whole bunch of people find these truths to be self-evident again, right? Or they, after argument.
But like, are they really self-evident? Like, why do we say that? Like, what are they evident by?
I think it goes back to calling them human rights instead of rights coming from God. And I think there's a long history of discussing what human rights are in the West and what that word means. So, I mean, I don't think they're just coming up with the idea that these are self-evident out of nowhere. I think it's being like, we have hundreds of years of thought over what humans have rights to, and we are putting them into this document.
Yeah, I think it might be hundreds of years now, but I don't think it was hundreds of years then. I'd be surprised if it were. We might go back and think of the first scholar you can think of that you can associate with rights language. My candidate is Locke, and Locke was. If it's a good question, was Locke still alive at that time?
I mean, it's certainly, I can't say exactly what I'm talking about, but I know that many of the ideas of the founders came from the Greeks. So
that's true, but I don't think the idea of rights is so easy to track there.
I mean, the only compelling argument of like, I mean, in lieu of like, we have hundreds of years of precedent, like the only like person explaining it to me, like, oh, this is why this right in particular is important to me. Like the only compelling argument I can think of is like the veil of ignorance. Like if you didn't know what position you were going to have in a society, like, would you want this protection? Totally. I'm trying to think of like other compelling, like just saying that things are like self-evident, like is not enough for me. And like, if I'm wrong, I'm happy to be wrong, but just like that doesn't satisfy my want to know why things are happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, just to drop that in history, that particular phrase is from John Rawls, right? Who's now dead, and fought in the fought in the Second World War, as I recall.
Is he really that recent?
Yeah. Yeah, he was alive when I was in graduate school. So yeah, I think he probably died in the 90s.
I misput him on the timeline.
Okay.
I thought he was much older than that.
Well, there's certainly quite a large emanations and penumbras around around his concepts, right? You hear about them. Yeah. You might think if you didn't have the veil of ignorance on, in fact, instead, if you had the ring of Gyges on, the ring such as Gyges' ancestor was said to have, I'm quoting from Book 2 of the Republic, that when you turn it in one direction, it makes you invisible. And you'd do what Gyges' ancestor did, says the two young men who were in fact Plato's brothers in real life. The characters in the dialogue of the Republic are Plato's two brothers, and they say what people said this ancestor did, the ancestor of Gyges, is he seduced the king's wife, killed the king, and ruled the kingdom, right, under cover of stealth. What any sensible person would do. So the argument goes, although people would praise the person who says, someone who says he or she wouldn't do that, would be praised to their face, but mocked behind their back. Either as naive, or as naive about themselves, or without ambition in the world, or something like that. And here I'm adding a little bit of text to the text of Plato. So that's far from the veil of ignorance. That's a veil of secrecy, right? And we're not, after all, under the veil of ignorance. Why would we ever put up with that? You might imagine why the bottom half of humanity would put up with that. And by the bottom half, I mean the weaker half. And now I'm right back to the text of the Republic, not in terms of half, but in terms of the weaker. Thrasymachus says justice is the advantage of the weak. Justice is a bad thing. Maybe that sort of Rawlsian justice is the advantage of the weak. That, of course, you'd go in if you put on that veil of ignorance and you called out a requirement of reason, not of the kind of reason that gets shit done, right? Someone might retort, not of that kind of reason. Kind of reason that gets stuff done, hangs onto that ring, right? It knows exactly what you can do and what you can't, and operates in the world. And other people, some people win and some people lose. That's the real state of nature. Someone like Thomas Hobbes might have said, right? In which life is nasty, Brutus, and short. And government is brought to bear to hold the captive, to hold these savages in place by some strong enough component, call it the majority, not maybe in Hobbes, but or an overwhelming, a super majority, and that's where government comes from. So that would be a different. What rights do you have in a government like that? Where would rights come from? Rights might come from, hey, I'm a Roman citizen, said Paul, right? And all of a sudden, people started treating Paul nicely in the New Testament. I appeal to Caesar, says Paul. I'm a Roman citizen. I have rights. Where'd those rights come from? You certainly know why all the people backed up and respected them, because they'd be crucified if they didn't. Not the language of the American foundation.
I'm a little bit trolled by the idea that just popped into my head. To me, like, I'm incredibly questioning where rights themselves come from. And I am just, the wheels are turning. I have not come to any conclusions or anything, but I certainly think like human beings ought to have certain rights, but I am not super convinced in where any of them come from. So I guess my question is, like, in any particular political system, whether it be like the American experiment or like anybody else, like, is it possible that we do not in fact have them? Like, I do think that like we ought to, like, human beings ought to be treated in a certain way, but like where, yeah, I just, and I wouldn't be like, I certainly would be quick to, if there was a regime that was like killing people based on religion or whatever, like I certainly would be like, oh, that is like very wrong. But I guess I'm wondering if there is a line to be drawn between like people having, like, objectively having rights and people being thought as to ought to have them.
So by ought to have them, do you mean exactly the same as ought to be treated in a certain way? Or do you think maybe you mean something more than that?
I think I just like ought to be treated in a certain way. And I get like, that begs the question, like, why ought they be to be treated in a certain way? Like, where does that ought come from? And if not, like a veil of ignorance, like, I mean, empathy, like understanding that like other people have similar emotions to you, and like the way you feel about a situation is like incredibly like can be parallel to how like other people feel about a situation. And like I'm remembering this from your paper, like that's something that like we treat kids, or that's something that we like teach kids as an important part of their socialization. But yeah, I'm just like struggling with that clarification at the moment.
Sure. Well, we could define, I don't mean to be flippant here, but I do think it's fun to explore these things a bit and put some names on it. You could define the art of sleeping well. If you want to sleep well, you probably ought not to beat up that small toddler, right? Because you will someday hear the cries of other children, and you will remember that many were at your hand, and you won't sleep very well, and that's going to catch up to you. So if you want to sleep well, it doesn't make sense for you to do that.
So does like treating other people rightly all come back to self-interest? I don't think that it does.
That's an interesting one. It's not exactly self-interest. In the case that I gave, it is, after all, the sleep of the person with a troubled conscience, or it could be considered that way, or at least the sleep of a person who has empathy for other people. It's that person's sleep. And it's the sleep of that empathetic person. And there you don't really want to say that's all about self-interest, not in every sense, right? If the person were all about self-interest, that would war against the empathy, or at least any real empathy, or any lasting or inconvenient empathy. How about that? There may be some convenient empathy.
Totally. To me, that looks like wanting to not have a guilty conscience is self-interest in the current system in which we live. So like, I mean, totally you could go to the extreme of like getting rid of any empathy you have. Like that's a choice you could make, but that's not like that's not really existing in the system we have. You have to become like on the fringes to do that. I guess is treating other people correctly, like correctly is a loaded term, treating other people in ways you as like a person who understands yourself and those around you through your own experience, treating them in a way in which you believe they might want to be treated, not only as a way to not have a guilty conscience yourself, but also because like people are ends in themselves, not just like a means for you to not feel bad about yourself at the end of the day.
Good. Well, you've just introduced some good language there. Ends in themselves, other people being ends in themselves, and not just a means to your happiness, which is apparently your end. They have ends too.
Yeah, to me it seems like a zoom out of like, rather than you being the main character in this world story, understanding that like you are the main character in your story, and similarly other people are the main character in their stories, and in the same way that like you have wants and interests, like this can be this like framework of desires and experience can be copied is maybe the wrong word, but reflected, that's a better word, reflected on others as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of like, what's your response to this? If you've got a knife and you notice you're in a knife fight, then you notice that those people have knives too, and they're trying not to get cut, and maybe they're trying to cut you for whatever the fight's about, right? And I get it. That's right. That I'm not the only person here. I'd have to be an idiot. I'd have to be a solipsist. I'd be dead already, right? If I didn't notice that there are other people who are agents. right? And their interests parallel mine in some regard.
Operation Don't Get
It doesn't
Stabbed.
follow that I should pick up their knife and cut me for them, right? I shouldn't do as they would, as they themselves would do. I shouldn't do as they themselves would like to get away with. I shouldn't do as they themselves maybe even would be happy to see me do. Should I? Not in those cases. I should do what they would do. They look out for themselves and I look out for myself. And we are, sure, we're equal. I get it. May the best person win, right? But that doesn't mean I put my knife down.
Totally. I feel like there's other options. Like, it is not just I either do what they are trying to do to myself and like stab myself with their knife, or like we can be creative. Like, we are, like, there are more than two options here.
Sure.
But yeah, I just, like, as long as you recognize that, like, in the same way that, like, they are people who have interests in, like, getting you stabbed, but probably, like, deeper than that. Like, what, like, my question is, like, what is this fight over? Like, what is, I mean, sometimes people, like, want to stab people for, like, the sake of stabbing people. Like, I'm sure that happens out there. And generally, I don't think that's usually the root of the problem. So, like, my intuition is like, okay, what are the bigger things at play here? And, like, can we resolve them in a different way? But, like, sometimes the answer is no, and you just have to, like, play off the fly with what you have. But
okay.
And, like, I'm, like, super getting into the weeds right now, but sometimes the weeds are not necessarily a horrible place to be. But I think the thing, I'm trying to remember how we found our way into this conversation.
Sure. We certainly found our way in at the biggest door that we walked through is what are rights? Do we have any? How do we know we have any? Right? And then is my having a right to something the same as I ought to be treated in a certain way? Right? You ought to treat me that way. And then where does that ought come from? Right? And then is it just the ought of you ought to do it if you want to sleep well, or if you don't want indigestion, or I'm being comical now, right? But some self-servient ought. Is there some richer ought you just sort of suggested when you broadened out my comical knife fight metaphor, right? Maybe not so comical, but you broaden that out to say, what's this fight all about anyway, right? And now you can treat the knife fight as a metaphor. What is this knife fight all about anyway? What's this whole human interaction, this whole human condition all about, right? What are we trying to get out of this deal anyway? Friendship, maybe? Because if you're interested in friendship, if you wanted that, you might, at least on occasion, have to put your knife down. Right? Because if you stab,
I don't want to be friends with people who try and stab me. That's just like a general baseline.
Yeah, that's right. So then you start to ask, are there some goods that emerge that are actually, if they're not being fought over with knives, maybe they're being negotiated over, or maybe they're being cooperated toward, right? Or maybe they're being something else. And now this knife fight doesn't quite look like that fight anymore. It doesn't look like war. It looks more like civil society. If you ever get a chance to reread in the Iliad, there's a scene in the Iliad where Achilles gets a shield. He's made a shield, and it's and all of life is carved on the shield, kind of comically and metaphorically and beautifully so. I mean, comically because you can't really imagine a shield with that much stuff going on. It takes some 2 pages of detail to talk about all the various things that are happening. But the point is, it's a picture of life, all of social life, and it's got war in it, and it's got farming in it, and it's got courts of law or something like it, some sort of negotiation and some intermediaries. It's got all of that on the shield, which is some great, beautiful thing to be beheld. So, what is this? What is life? And what are the goods of life, and how do we pursue them? And isn't that the information challenge? Isn't that to force it back into the metaphor? But I don't think it's too hard to force. Aren't we sort of confronted with all kinds of options, all kinds of ways of looking at things, all sorts of things we could do? And don't we process all of those options in a certain sense, including the testimony of other people as they've pursued various things, as they've developed craft of various sorts to do better rather than to do worse, as they run down these various roads, as they blend all these things together, as they work together in some sort of social cohesion to achieve some measure of these things together. All of that, isn't that where, aren't those the goods that are, in a way, the deliverances? They're the calculated product of living together. They're our best answer to what's worth living for. What should we do? How should we do it? And in there are certain things that we say are better and certain things that we say are worse, that are the analogs to losing and bleeding, or bleeding then losing, or something like that in the knife fight. And human life isn't a knife fight, not only, right? And it's got these other dimensions to it. And maybe what you ought to do, maybe there is a prudential ought, to use a word that isn't quite the same as self-interested, right? When I'm protecting my family that matters to me, am I being self-interested? When I protect my friends, when I give my life for my country, when I, etc., when I give my life for another person, no greater love has this. Am I being self-interested there because I'm advancing the cause of my friend? Which seems like if that's self-interest, it may be prudential. It may be the stuff a good person does to achieve the outcomes he or she wants. But it doesn't look so far removed from acting like a civilized, decent human being anymore. And maybe the rules that emerge from the crafts, don't stab your friend in the back. How would you like it if Jimmy hit you? Don't hit Jimmy, right? Those sorts of stories when you're little, that sort of become rules, that translates into general don't hit, right? And I remember all the things I need to know I learned in kindergarten. Don't hit. Those sorts of basic rules, maybe that's the stuff of morality. Maybe that's the sense in which you ought not to do it, because we understand, we've lived together long enough that we understand that this is not the way to pursue a life that you're going to be glad to have pursued. You're either going to pursue that life in relative ignorance, or you're going to regret that life when your ignorance is less. And so say all of us, right, who have lived this life together for a long period of time, and have some advice to give and some invitations to offer to people, some education really to offer, which is an invitation into this way of life, into this mature way of life. Maybe that's where oughts come from. It's a prudential ought that gets enriched and takes its content from the actual interactions of human beings who are working through all of their options in light of all the information they can get their hands on. on that model, rights come from rich communities. Language about you ought not to do this. This, in fact, is a need which you ought not to trespass. Neither you and I ought to trespass against this right, over this need. We ought not to ignore this need. In fact, we ought to act to ensure the satisfaction of this need within certain kinds of conditions. And a need in whose interest the mature members of a community recognize, a need whose satisfaction, in whose interest the mature members of the community recognize. I think that's a complete sentence, but it's a lot of clauses, sorry. Those needs are rights. And their action guiding force is the force of the practical wisdom accumulated in communities.
I think the concept of mature members of rich communities saves that theory, because like I've heard the idea discussed of like, if you've experienced things many ways and this is the one you choose, like that is what makes sense. I think that falters in if people have like particular biases or blinders, but if you have that concept but put the qualifier on it of like mature members of rich communities are the ones entering into, obviously like all people would enter into this process, but the data that you're particularly interested in is the choices of mature members of rich communities. I think that makes that theory more viable. Almost by definition.
It wipes away some obvious objections in the right. I think that's what I heard you saying.
Yes.
Okay. Now, of course, you've got these. Imagine if you don't already have this framework, and Rachel, I think you've seen this, but I'll run way back to the beginning, and because it's been a while since we pulled it up. Maybe you've seen it in the slide deck, but I've got a little physical image here that it'd be nice to have something like it in our heads. Come on, physical image. Yeah, unfortunately, the physical image did not translate well. Here's a slide in which it translated. It didn't survive the translation to Google Slides from PowerPoint because it had too much data in it. This is more like what's the phrase? This is like a fractal, actually. That each one of these, if it isn't literally a fractal, it's just like it. Each one of these is like a deep dive. Every little node is a deep dive into another map of this whole thing. So it's a network of networks. And now just imagine this. There's 7 of them, communities of all kinds of folks who are working through life and cranking out practical wisdom about how to move forward. And presumably they discover that they do better together. At least in lots of ways, they do better together than apart. And they pursue those ways, and they build a craft of being together. And they assert guidelines. They assert rules. They assert. They frown on certain things, right? There are raw emotional attitudes, negative attitudes toward things that seem to be just hanging out there. In fact, those are they may be non-cognitive information passing mechanisms in which I don't have to actually tell you what's wrong with this. I just have to have you, that thing just has to be associated for you with a lot of frowns. And it doesn't seem like a happy thing. It doesn't seem like a way to go. And there may be reasons for that. And maybe I tell you those reasons someday, or maybe I don't. But in the meantime, it just doesn't look that good for you. But that's what culture does. It makes things that are good look good. And so written throughout culture, explicit law, implicit culture, all sorts of things like that are a whole host of mechanisms for transferring the store of that group of people's experiences, that body of information, now impact your way of looking at the world, your seeing, and thus your choosing. And your choices get better being more informed, not in any simple linear way, but in general they do. And you're in one of these better, more informative sets of social circumstances. And so you embody a certain set of rules, a certain set of beliefs about how people ought to act. And then you find out that there are other people who have all the same claims as you have, but see the world differently. But they seem to see it wrong somehow. Things that are good look good to you. Things that your community thinks are good anyway, right, look good to you. And those people over there, their points of view, they don't look good to you. You weren't crafted that way. You don't dance to that tune. So now we're set. What we've just done is set the stage for a more informed question of relativism about rights. A more informed dive into what exactly are rights. Even if you think that there are needs of this sort, that there is a strong prudential reason to ensure are satisfied, and that prudential reason is very far from self-centered. It's got all of the other regardingness of friendship and parenthood. It's got all of that written into it. And yet you'd be a fool to abandon your friend. Are you kidding? You won't have any friends, right? I mean, a lonely person does that, and loneliness is bad. And we shouldn't have to tell you that, right? After you're 5 or something, you learn those basic lessons. Yeah, you just don't have any friends. That's because you hit Jane in the head with your lunchbox. She doesn't want to play with you now, right? And we go through those things, and you learn not to hit your friends with your lunchbox. So I've gone on and on, but that's an account of rights, but it's not a finished account, is it? Because all you have to do is figure out now, where are we in human history, and where have people amassed wisdom, and what is that wisdom that they've amassed, and what kinds of interactions have people with that wisdom had with other traditions who've amassed what shall we call it, a different flavor, a different character, a different species, different version, a different story. Maybe there's some common elements in those stories. Maybe there's some least common denominators. Maybe that would be easy. Or maybe there is something common, but it doesn't rely, it's not easy to get to. Maybe it's at the top, not at the bottom. I mean, I just described a little girl's experience with a lunchbox, right? When she's 4 or 5. Something you can discover when you're in kindergarten, that's easy. That doesn't mean you might not miss it, or might not miss it again later in life, but it's relatively easy, and you would expect those things, you'd keep bumping into those things almost everywhere. because it doesn't take a lot of experience to gain that perspective. But there may be other perspectives which take a lot of experience to gain, and yet are which are such that they still have a claim to universality, even though they're highly particular. Because the claim that they make is that if you become immersed in this tradition and enter into it and achieve a second first language competency in that tradition, become an imaginative, mature member, you will see through that lens a set of options that you come to prefer, even given the way you were raised. And so we may have a whole host of complementary sorts of rationales for pointing to acknowledgement of the claims of a given tradition as really having something to teach all of us, even though we might disagree about what it is that they all have to teach us, or how much of it we already knew, or how we characterize that. Because the path to conversion may be different from all of us, but we may nonetheless, you could say now, universally come to grasp that particular truth, because we've come to take on maturity, imaginative maturity, in that particular tradition. That, it seems to me, is the best account I know of for what rights are. Rights are needs whose satisfaction, if they're human rights, I may have a right, abstracting from a right in a contract, for example. I have a right now because I'm a signer of this, I'm in this contractual relationship. You don't have that right, right? It's not a human right, not in that sense. There may be some other more fundamental human right in the neighborhood, like a right to be treated as with good faith in contracts, right? Which you and I might both share. But then I might accrue some additional right in the context of that contract, but we wouldn't call it a human right. And I'm only talking about human rights now. So I'm backing out of those derivative senses and focusing on this primary sense and saying these are rights that we might hold as self-evident. At least they're self-evident to the mature members of a tradition and to others who have come to take on that tradition as in second first language competency. There's a certain kind of self-evidence. Culture has made these things which are good look good. The satisfaction of those needs and the claim of the person with those needs to my action is a claim that's acknowledged by mature members whose choices have in fact been maximally informed by information about their options. That's a universal human right. And it has de jure action guiding force for every person. What I mean by, the de jure de facto distinction, sometimes they use it that way. De facto means it in fact moves you. A claim might in fact move you. Another claim in fact binds you, applies to you, whether you think it does or not. And human rights claims are like that. They may or may not move you because you may or may not be formed well, but they have a claim and they function in language as if they had a claim on your time and your attention, because they actually do have a de jure claim on your time and your attention. It is in fact the way to go for you. Practice will make perfect. You'll become the kind of human being that you will want to become were you to be richly informed about your options. And so this is the way forward for you. so that rights claim asserts. Save that drowning child in the pool, you idiot. Of course you should do that. It's deeply wrong if you don't, and the child has a right to your assistance. And we can use those phrases that way.
Yeah, that's an interesting definition of self-evident. I was thinking about that a little bit, and I didn't really know what I thought that word meant or phrase meant. But those rights being self-evident would only apply to people raised in that particular society, though. It doesn't make them universally self-evident.
Except in a different sense, not in the de facto sense. Self-evident in the de facto sense, only to some, perhaps. Aquinas drew the distinction per se nota and, forget the Latin, evident in itself or evident to us. So it may not be evident to us, but it is evident in itself. In other words, it's there to be seen. You just don't see it, right? And your task as a human being, as an information gatherer, an information processor, to use my language, right, is to become somebody who becomes informed and thus perceives, thus calculates the right outcome. So this is the way, right? This is the way for you, whether you think it is or not. So but the point there is, it is the right way for you, and it is evident in itself. And so it is self-evident in, I'll admit, a very technical and non-standard, but nonetheless very important sense. It's the same self-evidence that we think we have when it does grab us. And we see it clearly. We see, of course, this is what I ought to do. We're saying it is exactly that all the time for everyone, but not everybody gets that. For humans, that is. So in a certain sense, it's not self-evident. You have to admit, and you were right, John, I mean, it's not self-evident to everybody in a very straightforward sense.
Yeah.
And I would say in the primary sense, I mean, that's what people think of, right? But this is sort of a scientific sense. I mean, people think of all kinds of things that they change their conceptions of when they study it more carefully.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And this is among those things.
Yeah, it would seem pretty difficult for me to imagine, or because I could imagine all sorts of things that are very important that I think all humans should have access to. But if elevating those things to something that I found to be self-evident, I think that would be an interesting discussion, or how that distinction would ever be made. Obviously you can say, like, well, everyone at these high information flow networks and all these adult members are all in agreement that they think this, or on some level, but it does seem like kind of a hard line to cross between what is good for people and what is self-evidently good for everyone.
Right. So Rachel's discussion about rights to universal health care is a great example in this regard, right? I mean, there are a lot of people would say, of course, you don't have a right to universal health care. You have a right to, you've got a right to life, to liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not the guarantee of it, right? Or maybe any part of it, someone might say. And you're on your own in terms of healthcare. You might be able to enter into it by contract. The market determines the right amount of contract and the way to distribute goods that way. so someone might say, right? And so there is no right to universal health care. But Rachel's instincts are different. Her instincts are, you've got a right to life, and yet we're going to bankrupt you in order to simply save your life under technically now not unusual circumstances, right? You need a blood transfusion. We know how to do that. It just costs a lot of money to get it, and no one's going to pay for it, so your kid dies. This is a right to happiness. This is a right to pursuit of happiness. Yeah, I'm entitled to pursue it. I just don't have the right contracts inked.
Yeah, I mean, that is interesting, because if you were going to put healthcare under right to life, I mean, you must always also put right to food, water, and housing, I would assume, which would be just as basic. And I don't know how well or not we guarantee those to people in the United States. I don't think we do in any significant way. But even if we did, I mean, we have safety nets that do a decent job of helping people in the greatest need sometimes. But, and then it always gets into, I mean, you're not guaranteed like like crab legs and lobster with you're guaranteed a food. So, I mean, I think it's not quite as simple as that's just you're guaranteed access to food or guaranteed access to water, guaranteed access to healthcare. I mean, there's always going to be other factors.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of complexities to be worked out. Some of those complexities have been worked out in some rich traditions. Aquinas, for example, worked a great deal of these sort of complexities out and articulated them in the Summa Theologica, other places as well, but there particularly as an introduction to a whole system of thought and practice for novice would-be theology teachers, something like that, as a curriculum for people. In that account, God universally distributes the good for the well-being of all of creation and for all of human beings in a particular way. And the things that you need to continue to live, if you lack them, we say you're poor, but you have a right to those things. And if they're accumulated by others and not shared with the poor have the right to them, and they do no wrong when they take them. It's not theft.
Mm.
There's perhaps a very radical sounding, almost a to each according to his need dimension of Aquinas' thought. There I'm quoting from Marx's Communist Manifesto. And there's a certain alignment in that respect between those two different traditions that seem to be in agreement in that way. You can point to those, but I think you can also point to the character. You can point to individuals. I mean, I don't mean to make it too personal, Rachel, but I'll use you as an example, right? Your instinct, that right to that respect for life necessarily carries forth into respect for the needs that promote life, at least some reasonable measure of them, right? Which you talked about as a right to health care. You didn't talk about a right to your 12th liver transplant, right? Or something like that. I'm saying that there may be rational limits here, right? But in general, there may be, my point here is your instincts point you in that direction. And then the question is, are those instincts produced by a way of life which has a rich purchase on human experience and passes that experience down and accumulates it systematically so that you inherit it in your character. And so is what's self-evident to you in that respect, is it precisely the kind of self-evidence that the founders were reaching for and didn't quite know how to put their finger on when they said, we hold these truths to be, they're self-evident, right? That self-evidence could be a cultural achievement. It could be the fruit of these richer traditions, which I just made reference to, embodied, carried out all the way through the raising of good men and women, right? Whose instincts are reliable. It could be, right? I mean, that's the question to ask. And boy, is this a big question. This is a deep question, and I don't think people realize it. This invites everybody to do an inventory of their commitments, their thought to be insights, and say, where did those come from? Is it possible that they're present in me because of some rich passing on of accumulation and passing on of information that I've inherited as someone who's been brought up in a certain tradition? And if that's the case, the fact that I don't know how to make the argument for them is not a good reason for dismissing them. It could be the argument is laid out in the historical connections which have been made but need to be rediscovered historically. Otherwise, you can't tell. So this is good, probably a good place to stop. Maybe our instincts about rights aren't everything, but maybe they're not nothing either.
I think that's true about most things. Our instincts are generally not nothing, but also generally not everything either.
No, you're right. Right. But I think we have a little more to say than everything and nothing now, right?
True.
About those instincts. But you're right. That's probably not enough said. Here's where you plug in the analysis of self-esteem. What does a tradition know about how human beings ought to think about themselves, think about others? On the basis of what do we, this instinct that people are ends and not means, is there anything to that? Where does that come from? Is that actually a deliverance of prudential experience, calculation, rule forming, craft building? Or is it an easy substitute for real argument that's put together because we don't know the answer? And so, I mean, you could imagine someone fixing a pretty shallow, I'm not, here I'll take Rawls's veil of ignorance as an example, not that I'm claiming that it's shallow, but that it can be communicated and entered into, I think, relatively easily. And you wonder if it's just a patch. Is it just sort of it's one way to solve the problem, right? We could all drop ourselves in this hypothetical situation and we could call that the deliverances of reason. Are they the deliverances of reason or are they not? Are they just because you say so and because it solves the problem? Or is there something richer? Is there a rich account you can give of what reason is and why?
I think your idea of a patch is very helpful. To me, it looks like a helpful metaphor through which to understand, but like certainly not a true explanation in and of itself.
You suspect it being a patch because a patch would function like that, but it doesn't follow. I mean, a lot of things, take the command of a ruler. The command of a ruler functions like that. In fact, people think divine command theorists in ethics have thought that that's the way God functions, right? Why are things right or wrong? Because God says they are, right? He says, do this, and he's the right kind of commander. And you should just do what he says. And that's what makes things right and wrong. And you have to admit, that's a very easy answer. It doesn't seem to hold up to scrutiny very well. What if he's an asshole, right? What if he's, or she, right? Or why would you do what that powerful thing said? What if she's Athena, or worse than Athena? Because Athena, and what if she's Mars, or switching to Roman gods? What if he's Mars, right? Why would you obey Mars? Because he'll get you if you don't? Okay. That makes you want to seem to the gods to obey the gods. If you could throw them some sacrifices, you should. Maybe they'll like that better, and you can do whatever the hell you want, right? And now you're talking the kinds of religious practices that grow up in that environment. But the point is, that's an easy patch of an answer, right? And without knowing the character of the commander, without knowing a great deal about it, you don't know that there may be something there and there may not be. There are people that you and I both know that if they tell you in a pinch that you need to do something, you do it, right? Because their assessment is sharper, and their intentions are better, at least better than any other set you can find at the moment. They're the person to listen to here, and you fall in line and you follow, and you do it precisely because they asked you to. That's possible. But that doesn't make the action right. But it's like the veil of ignorance, right? It's a simple thing to appeal to in a given situation. There may be more to it and there may not be. You're going to have to dig. All right. Well, I think if nothing else, we had a better look at our American tradition. A little bit. So let's move to an open topic on Wednesday, and
Sweet.
talk about what you want to do.
Cool.
Yep. There will be, of course, there is a convention going on this week. Anybody wants to watch the convention and swing in that space, we could, or we could move on to other matters. I'm biting my tongue and simply calling them other matters.
Is it the DNC convention this week?
It starts tonight. Yeah, started already.
When is the RC?
Is it next week or the week after? Or
yeah, I think it's pretty soon after this one. I thought it was a week later, but I don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Well, enjoy your evening. Thanks for spending some time.
You too. Enjoy
definitely.
your evening.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks.
Have a good night.
All right.
You too.
Bye, guys.